what's interesting to me so often is in the lives of some of these amazing thinkers. I think of Blaise Pascal, for instance, extraordinary intellect, mathematician, philosopher, very devout Christian, wrote some of the most extraordinary works of apologetics in his age, actually. But ultimately, it was this extraordinary experience of God that he said was the thing that grounded his faith. Not the God of the philosophers, as he said, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, fire. And that was, what he had stitched into his jacket.
Justin, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Anyone with their ear to the cultural pulse will have detected a softening, if not embracing, of the Christian values, from, say, Joe Rogan's outright skepticism to softening, from Jordan Peterson's biblical lectures to an audience of millions, to Russell Brand's even conversion. And there's many people with whom you mentioned within your book, such as Douglas Murray and Tom Holland, who discuss these values and see the merit in them. And whilst many of us were formulating our ideas on this cultural shift, you were one step ahead and wrote a book about it. What occurring themes were you seeing to the point where you thought you had enough information to write a book?
Well, I guess I was in the privileged position of having hosted a lot of conversations on faith over 17 years at the point where I finished hosting the show, Unbelievable. And that was a show that brought together Christians and non-Christians and people from lots of different worldviews. And so I saw a real sort of change in the sort of the nature of the conversations in that sort of decade and a half or more, because it's the show began, this dialogue show began in the heyday of New Atheism, when the public conversation on faith was these really dogmatic debates between, these hardline atheists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Chris Hitchens, and, Christian apologists and so on. And that was fun and got a lot out of that, and learned actually that Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet intellectually. But I did notice a real shift in the conversation, probably around 2017, 2018. And it just felt like New Atheism had really fizzled out by that point for all kinds of reasons. And I just noticed some of the people you've mentioned there, people like Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, Douglas Murray, suddenly these not necessarily Christian secular thinkers, but nevertheless being far more open, warm, sympathetic to Christianity and to the values specifically that Christianity has given the West. And I just saw, a lot more of these people coming out of the woodwork. And I thought, I wonder if something's changing. I was hosting them on my show. I was, frequently, by this point, putting even 2 non-Christians together, because actually sometimes the non-Christians were doing just as good a job as the Christians of sort of representing the value of Christianity and that kind of thing. And so I'd say 2018, a lot of people may be aware that's kind of the year that Jordan Peterson kind of really came to public awareness. He was sort of across a lot of social media. His YouTube channel was growing very fast. He was filling out these auditoriums, and indeed like the O2 in London, for debates with Sam Harris and that kind of thing. And I just noticed that there wasn't nearly the same level of skepticism and vitriol towards faith and Christianity that there had been in the era of the New Atheists. So that all of that stuff sort of, as we sort of headed towards 2020 and obviously the lockdown and pandemic and so on, sort of got me thinking, well, I wonder if there's a sort of cultural shift afoot. It feels like people are starting to talk about faith much more positively. I was having these conversations. I was also noticing some really interesting stories of people converting to Christianity, quite, significant, well-known names. Paul Kingsnorth, the poet and author, wrote this sort of viral article, The First Things, about his conversion in 2021. I was hearing about Nick Cave, the musician, sort of starting to go to church and exploring faith. And then, and probably, most significantly, shortly after my book got published, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, probably the most famous female atheist in the world, came out again with this viral article titled Why I'm Now a Christian. And she was very much part of that new atheist clique, So it was really interesting to see that all happening. And I did sort of manage to kind of preempt it to some extent. The book kind of came to me as an idea around 2020, 2021, as I was seeing some of this stuff. So I put it together. And so I started writing it. It got published in 2023. And yeah, it was really that year that lots of people started to notice this, that actually something had changed. And I just happened to have written a book that sort of tried to give it a title, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. So that's how it happened, really.
There is a sliding scale, however, from the recognition of Christian values to the entertaining of the existence of God, to the believing in God, all the way down the scale to believing that Jesus rose from the dead and that he came to save your sins. Many of these people, say a Douglas Murray, for example, are very much at one end of the scale of where they're entertaining the idea. As a Christian apologist, where do you see that sliding scale? Does it give you hope that they're at least on the scale? Or are you filled with despair that there's quite a long way to go?
No, I think I'm more of a hopeful person. I am an optimist by nature, so maybe that's just me. But I think it's because I've seen where we've come from in that sense, seeing how Christianity and faith in general was just absolutely, seen as ridiculous fairy tales, nonsense, only 15 years ago in the public square. And that was where all the attention was, that was where, the people who had all the platforms were the people who were saying this stuff. The God Delusion sold millions of copies, and you had things like the Atheist Bus campaign in London saying there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. Very difficult to imagine that happening now. And I think, so I absolutely acknowledge your point that a lot of the people I talk about in the book and in the podcast series I've released as well, they're definitely on this sliding scale, as you say. And you've got people who almost quite cynically, I think, at one end of the scale, see Christianity as more sort of a useful fiction, that it's kind of socially useful. Even Richard Dawkins has, worn the label cultural Christian. He's happy to say, yes, there are some beneficial effects of Christianity, but don't ask me to believe it. It's still all poppycock kind of thing. So you've definitely got that sort of sentiment. I think, yeah, as you say, somewhere along the middle, there's maybe people a bit more like Douglas Murray who sort of seem to be attracted actually to Christian faith, even though they can't convince themselves to believe it, but they absolutely believe in its value. You've got people like Tom Holland, the historian, I think kind of teetering on the edge, if not having really gone into Christianity as a regular churchgoer, as someone who I think has encountered something quite mysterious that he wants to dive into. He's had a sort of intellectual conversion, again, like so many of them, to the value of Christianity. But I think he genuinely sees that there's something there now. And then you've got the Ironhurst Yalleys and the Paul Kingsnorth, as I mentioned, who are, I think, have kind of embraced it and said, yeah, I'm in. I don't think this. I think this story works because it's true. And so that's the sliding scale. I want everyone to kind of move in the direction, obviously, of the Paul Kingsnorth and so on, but everyone's on their own journey. And the interesting thing is that some of these influencers like Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson, who it's hard to say exactly where they are sometimes, I think they actually have a greater, if you like, evangelistic clout outside the church than inside the church, because people are willing to give them a hearing, and so to some extent, yeah, as a Christian myself, I would love them to sort of embrace the fullness of the faith, but at the same time, I can see that they're doing an awful lot of good from where they are as well. So it's an interesting one, but I as I say, I'm generally an optimist when it comes to these things.
Is that Richard Dawkins quip that he attends evening song, he loves the carol service, he's very interested in church architecture, but he doesn't believe in God, and so it makes him a fairly typical Anglican?
Yeah, well, maybe. The reality is that I think that sort of caricature of an Anglican is actually disappearing, actually. And it's partly because of the work of, ironically, people like Dawkins. And the sad fact is that it's a very strange and contradictory stance he takes, because he says he likes the cathedrals and the Christmas carols and the evensongs. But you obviously won't have any of that stuff in the future if the church continues to decline. And that has been the story. And Richard Dawkins has been one of the ones, trying to hasten its decline. So it's a very odd thing that he sort of on the one hand wants it and the other hand doesn't. But the reality is, I think most it's true that kind of nominal Anglicanism that Richard Dawkins is referring to there has been very common, I think, in sort of the mid-20th century. But actually, I think it's far less common today. People tend to be going to church now because they actually believe in it. There's lots of other options on a Sunday morning, and there's no sort of cultural pressure to be a Christian. People, I don't think anymore even feel the need to tick it on the census, in the sense that they might once have done. So I think that sort of cultural Anglicanism has waned, and actually what you're left with, I think, is churches and Christians going to the churches who actually really want to be there and they really believe in this stuff. And sometimes I find you have to kind of get to that point where we sort of shed the sort of accumulation of cultural Christianity that builds up over a generation or two before you kind of get to a point where, yes, things have kind of declined and diminished, but actually you might have a core of people who are willing to do something to see it come back again. So that's my sense of it.
As someone who's been at the forefront of a debate for so long, do you ever see a contrast between the intellectual heavyweights fighting it out over the existence of God and the recipient of, say, Jesus's teachings 2,000 years ago? The people with whom Jesus was speaking to were often illiterate and probably uneducated. So the presupposition that you need intelligence in order to comprehend the divine doesn't really stack up if we look at the scriptures. What do you make of that paradox?
I think the scriptures are full of paradoxes like that. And indeed, the scriptures often talk about those paradoxes. Paul says, that the wisdom of God confounds the wise because he's made these things, available to those of low estate. And there's a sense of the foolishness, of the Christian message to so many that is absolutely there. And of course, Jesus talks about you have to become like a child to enter the kingdom of God. There's something at one level, very simple, very straightforward, that does not require some great intelligence. And yet at the same time, we know that St. Paul was an incredibly intelligent person. You only have to read his letters to see just how highly intelligent he was, even as much as Jesus also, his first followers were fishermen and so on. So I think it's just an example of the way in which Christianity, from its very inception, has attracted both and has spoken to both. And I think continues to do so today. And that's always been my perception as I've, hosted shows that have tended to focus on intellectual debate, philosophy, science, history, so lots of super intelligent people on both sides, Christian and atheist, coming on. But no one listening to those shows would be left in any doubt that there are plenty of smart Christians out there. Okay, people who are very clever who believe this stuff. But at the same time, I'm a member of a local church, and everybody is there, and I'm constantly reminded that there's something about the gospel that is simple enough for a child to comprehend and deep enough for the wisest sage to ponder on for, millennia. So for me, that's part of the attraction actually of Christianity, that it has this ability to speak to every person from every background in that way.
The existentialist Søren Kierkegaard wrestled night and day with the scriptures and the whole God question. And he would then go to church, having wrestled with it night and day, and he would say an old lady praying there. And then he would be exasperated because that little old lady had more faith than him. What do you make of the intellectual burden in which many of your guests over the past 17 years have had to carry when approaching the issue of the existence of God?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in some ways that's the right description of it. I think it can be a burden. I think people who are wired that way, often faith is difficult because they're wired to sort of pull things apart and examine things at a sort of logical level. And there's aspects of faith that kind of, it's difficult to do that to, because you're talking about something that at some level transcends purely intellectual, rational approach. And so, yeah, I've seen that frequently in the lives of people who are these deep thinkers. They are frequently the ones who are, as much as they can sort of come up with incredible, creative, compelling arguments for God, they're often also the ones who are assailed the most by doubts, because they also see every flaw in their argument, along the way. I suppose I've always, at a simple level, I've always believed and seen that Christianity is a faith that is about the head and the heart. So for me, it's when those two come together that you have a kind of fully orbed Christian faith. And we were never meant to be Christian purely at an intellectual level. I don't think anyone comes to faith, comes into the kingdom, as it were, on the basis of purely on the basis of an argument, though intellectual arguments may be an important part of the journey for some people who are wired that way, as I say. But in the end, yeah, faith is obviously going to be more than that. It's something about the heart. It's something about a movement towards God at a very deep level. And for many people, that is sort of the primary way in which they encounter God, I think. They just don't need, for whatever reason, a particularly intellectual approach. And I can understand why Kirkergaard sort of envied the woman at prayer who just didn't have all these sort of questions floating around her mind necessarily. And I also have been in that position myself, where I've sort of, had a sleepless night over some big question. And I look at the person in the pew next to me and think, gosh, maybe they don't have to go through that. I think in a way, we need both, though. I think the church is poorer when it's purely filled by people who experience God in some direct way, as wonderful as that is, but it doesn't have anyone who's sort of thinking about it and trying to make sense of it logically. And equally, if it was all just filled with philosophers and theologians, it would become very dry and stuffy. So I'm very open to that. And what's interesting to me so often is in the lives of some of these amazing thinkers. I think of Blaise Pascal, for instance, extraordinary intellect, mathematician, philosopher, very devout Christian, wrote some of the most extraordinary works of apologetics in his age, actually. But ultimately, it was this extraordinary experience of God that he said was the thing that grounded his faith. Not the God of the philosophers, as he said, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, fire. And that was, what he had stitched into his jacket. Because, and that's sort of, kind of my story as well. I've kind of chased down a lot of these intellectual arguments and so on over the years. I've found it really helpful at some level in my own life. But my entry into faith was an experience, of God. It wasn't an intellectual argument. So I think we need to always be open to the fact that God sort of does transcend those things,
With that recognition that the experience of God is an emotional experience, do you find, or have you found over the past 17 years, that there's been too much reliance on the head over the heart, on the intelligence and not the emotion when facilitating these debates? And is that, do you think, why a lot of the time people are unable to get past a certain point of two interlocutors in a debate, that they just don't really make any progress because it's so head heavy, if that makes sense?
I think that's right. I think in a sense, though, if you're kind of inviting people into a debate, you're kind of setting the terms of the engagement anyway, and you're making it something about the head. So it would hardly be fair to criticize people for taking too much of a sort of head approach to things when you've invited them to debate some, technical subject, the Kalam cosmological argument or whatever. As I say, I think there's a value to that. I think traditional apologetics in that sense for some people is really important, because it is important to kind of sort out a lot of those questions. But as I say, it's not going to replace that sort of more experiential aspect that is an important aspect of faith as well. So, and I do think that probably, especially during the heyday of the New Atheism, which was very much geared at provoking these kinds of intellectual questions and objections, inevitably the pendulum kind of swung quite far towards engaging them on those terms. having these highly sort of, intellectual debates, these set pieces of, William Lane Craig versus Christopher Hitchens or whatever. And it probably gave the impression to a lot of people, especially non-Christians watching that, oh, this is what Christianity is. It's a sort of intellectual sparring match where the person with the best argument kind of wins the day. And of course, that is absolutely not what Christianity is. But it could easily give the impression that it is. And so I think that was a danger. And I think in a way, you by sort of playing by those rules, you do run the risk of turning Christianity into something that it isn't. I've been quite encouraged in a sense that a lot of people I've met who sort of maybe were involved in that important sort of apologetic response to the new atheism are also recognizing actually there's also an important place for imagination and for mystery and for sort of not surrendering the intellect, but acknowledging that faith at some level transcends those things as well. So one of the things I've been focusing on really, as I've seen this sort of what I call the surprising rebirth moment in our culture, is that most people don't start with intellectual questions about philosophical evidence for God and so on. They start with existential questions about meaning and purpose and identity. And you have to engage that. And probably the best place to engage that is through a more imaginative approach rather than a sort of strictly analytical or intellectual approach. It goes without saying that the best apologists have always actually married those two things. C.S. Lewis is the classic example of someone who was brilliant at doing the rational apologetics through classics like Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain, but he also opened up Christianity probably most successfully to people through fantasy fiction, through the Chronicles of Narnia and so on. So for me, that's always been the best approach is, again, to use that analogy, the head and the heart coming together in that way.
The issue, I guess, on an intellectual level about the heart is that it's very difficult to measure. There's facts, there's logic, there's argument. It's all very strict and it's in its boxes. Whereas the heart, as you alluded to, it sort of merges all of them together, which makes it on an intellectual level very difficult to comprehend or even to measure. With the very intellectual arguments in which you were facilitating Unbelievable, with your new podcast series, what are you taking from Unbelievable and applying to the new podcast series? And what are you changing about your approach?
Well, one of the things that is quite different about the new podcast series is just the format, actually. And that, in a way, I think is somewhat illustrative of this point I'm trying to make, which is that the Unbelievable show, and I loved hosting it, was very much a kind of sit down with two guests for an hour and a half, and kind of going back and forth. And it was, as you say, that very kind of left-brained, let's say, approach to thinking about the issues. And people, who liked that approach loved it. The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast series, however, is much more a sort of storytelling podcast. And I've deliberately put a lot more time, effort, and resource into creating, hopefully, a very sort of engaging sort of documentary podcast sort of vibe to it, where you're drawn into a story through sort of archive material, through narration, through music, through all the different talking heads that I feature on it. And to that extent, I think that in itself it is one of the ways in which I think it's helpful to sort of mix things up a bit, is to sort of, when you're telling a story about something, and in this case it's the story of the rise and fall of new atheism and the growth of this new conversation around God, I think it kind of engages people at a slightly different level than just that purely analytical approach. And so it's been really fun to see a whole new audience really coming out for this new series than would have ever really been interested in listening to, an hour to an hour and a half of debate on the Unbelievable show. But I'm bringing in a lot of clips and bits and pieces from the Unbelievable shows from over the years, because part of the story I'm telling is about, as I say, this changing nature of the conversation. And so it's really fun to kind of introduce bits and pieces in a kind of hopefully palatable way to this new audience of some of these really interesting debates and dialogues that have happened over the years. So it's definitely a merger of the two, of kind of, yes, some traditional apologetics, because I'm still some episodes are kind of making the case for the reliability of the Bible and the evidence for the resurrection, that kind of thing. But sort of woven into this more of a kind of storified way of doing it, I think just helps to engage that right side of the brain, which the psychologists and neuroscientists tell us is actually the part of the brain that takes a more holistic view, more imaginative sense. And so I've been really pleased to see the response, the positive response it's had from both believers and non-believers who have been listening to that show. And yeah, certainly within that, I'm kind of also encouraging through the content in that podcast, people to consider the way in which the imagination also speaks to us. Because if we are, I use this imagery of story a lot in the podcast and the book. I don't think we're just sort of brains on legs, kind of just calculating machines. We are people who live or approach life as though we're living within a story. And so the whole kind of thesis really of the book and the podcast is that the story that once gave shape and meaning to our lives, the Christian story, it's kind of been sidelined over the last 100, 150, maybe longer years, basically since the Enlightenment. And as that story has gone away, we haven't become these sort of rational scientific types that I think Dawkins and co hoped we would suddenly turn into. We've actually just replaced that story with other stories. Many of them, we don't think of them often, those stories, as religious, but they are actually quasi-religious in their way. Stories about identity and sexuality maybe on the left, or political mythologies on the right. And so my thesis is really that the stories we're telling ourselves just aren't working out. They're all bumping up against each other, creating the culture wars, so they're leaving a sort of trail of exhausted, burdened people, especially Gen Z in the era of, smartphones and social media. And so through, I just want to kind of suggest to people there's a better story to invest your life in and to make sense of yourself in. Now, that's not a strictly logical argument, but it's an argument that really appeals to people because we're storytelling creatures. We need a story just to live a life that makes sense to us coherently. And actually, it turns out a lot of people are sort of finding, this funny old story that, my parent or grandparents rejected might actually have something to say to me. So I think that's for me is like the bit where it comes in. It's this idea that the story is coming back and it's appealing on different levels. Yes, definitely there's an intellectual side to it, and I'm all for that for the people who need that. But it's a kind of, it's something deeper than that. It's like it's something that speaks to us at a deeper level, the story. And people, I think, are really thirsty for that right now.
There is a theme in the scriptures of unassuming normal people being used for the will of God. If we look at, say, Rahab the prostitute, the woman at the well, even Mary, the mother of Jesus, who was probably illiterate, if we look at the evidence of the time, there's these normal people with whom have been touched or are used in God's supposed plan in the scriptures. And what I noticed in your new podcast series is that you have quite a lot of normal people who have come on and are sharing their story. And it is the storytelling. It's not that they have any less credibility than the professors with whom I'm studying this night and day, that they're just coming at it from a new angle.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. And I think that's the nice thing about doing a podcast like this, is, a lot of it is just people's stories. Lots of them are people who sort of, whether explicitly or implicitly, sort of adopted at one time that secular material story of reality, because that was kind of the water they were swimming in at university or whatever, but have just come to find it doesn't work for them. And suddenly they bump into God in some way, or they have an experience that suddenly wakes them up to the reality of God. And it's been really fun to catalog some of those experiences. And in many ways, very often I find those often speak more powerfully to people than, the history professor kind of going on about the historicity of the Bible or whatever. It's actually people's personal experiences that we often relate to in so many ways. And I fully accept, for some people, it's very hard. That doesn't constitute evidence for some people because, hey, people from all kinds of different religious traditions can have experiences and say this helped me, that helped me. But at the same time, I suppose I just want to hold out the fact that people do encounter God in all kinds of ways and from all kinds of backgrounds. And it would be a great shame, as I say, if people were given the impression, which I think, as I say, possibly was given during the era of new atheism and the big debates of apologetics, that you have to have some PhD and whatever to sort of understand Christianity and know God. It's just not the case. So I've been really encouraged, to be able to bring some of those stories to the fore. I mean, I had a lovely sort of encounter with a woman from China, who I give the name Jenny on the show, who again had a really interesting story. She's not a well-known person by any means, but she just got in touch with me, and she told me how she had come from sort of atheist communist background in China and had come to the UK a couple of decades ago and had just noticed something different about the way people treated each other, the kind of the compassion, the sort of sense that, people, whoever they were and whatever their background was, were worth looking after. Something she really hadn't encountered back home in the communist Chinese state. And she and the other expatriates that, she was around noted this and said, well, maybe it's something in the water, we like it. We're not quite sure what it is. It was only sort of really, as she kind of started to kind of experience some issues herself, a sort of a crisis of sort of purpose and so on, that she stumbled really one night on some sermons online, and she started to read about Christianity, and she thought she sort of knew what it was, but she realized she really didn't. And suddenly a lot of pennies started dropping, and she realized, this Christianity, that's what made the difference here. This is what was lacking back home. This is what sort of created this culture where these values are sort of embedded. She sort of discovered the Tom Holland thesis, if you like, kind of independently, and then started, getting into and, discovered at that point Unbelievable and lots of the debates and dialogues and things. And it was just fascinating to sort of see it from her perspective as someone not particularly, educated or eloquent or whatever, but she just started to put things together for herself. And one of the things that really stayed with me was her almost indignant sense when she started to see Richard Dawkins kind of railing against the Bible and that kind of thing, and the God of the Old Testament. She said, Richard Dawkins can only rail against God because he was basically has come from a Christian culture. That the atheists in China would have no problem with someone, obliterating someone else, because that is just the way things are. That's just the way the culture is. That's just the dog-eat-dog world we live in. Richard Dawkins, however, judges the Bible by his very Christian standards, she said. And so it's it was just a real breath of fresh air to see someone sort of who had come to faith from a very different background, but kind of, telling their story. And it was this mixture of personal experience, but also, this dawning awareness that Christianity represented something very different to what she had known before.
That marrying of a transformational experience in the belief in God, but also the, say, transactional of recognizing the value in which it's held to society. Where do you fall on that line? Is it more transformational that you need to have in order to have a relationship with God? Or is it more transactional, that it's through evidence and looking through the pieces of the past that you can then come to conclude?
I think it's that the balance is going to be different for different people. So as I say, I know people who have come to faith through almost purely a kind of experiential frame, and others for whom putting the pieces together intellectually was really important. But I'm just very glad, in a sense, that Christianity has always had both of those things. baked in from the beginning. It was never a faith from the outset that was purely about someone having some personal divine revelation, and everyone else was expected to sort of believe it purely on the basis of what they said, which is arguably what you do have with, say, Islam, which is just a revelation to Muhammad, or something like Mormonism, which is just Joseph Smith's accounts. It was Christianity, by contrast, was a very public sort of set of historical claims that could be verified or falsified. And a lot of people went about in the first century saying that this person, Jesus Christ, had been crucified and had risen again. And in that sense, it's always had, I think, that sense that it's okay. This is something that you can test, that you can sort of look at, and but it's also, of course, always been something that's encountered at a very kind of personal, spiritual level. So for me, that's a very good thing. And inevitably, I don't want to say it's one or the other. It's always going to be both in that sense. I do think, when you said transactional, one of the things I wondered if you were hinting at was whether the fact that a lot of this renewed interest in God is coming from this place, as we said earlier, of the cultural benefits of Christianity and so on. And I think for me, there is a danger there that if you go looking to kind of bring back Christianity purely for its cultural benefits, you're putting the cart before the horse, because the only reason Christianity produced the values and the things you enjoy about Western culture is because the people who went and created that culture by creating hospitals and education establishments and human rights and everything else, it's because they were fired up by their very real belief that God had made himself known in Jesus Christ, and this had completely changed the world. So to start to try and sort of inculcate those values and beliefs again in our culture without really believing the story, I don't think is going to happen. It's this, lots of people talk about this analogy of, can you have the fruits without the roots? And I don't think you can. I think it's impossible to sort of generate that stuff without the story that fires it in the first place. So it's not. So some sociologists have said, well, Christianity is sort of metaphorically true because it works. I'd say it's the other way around. I'd say it works because it is literally true. That's the reason why it's been so successful. But at the same time, and this was brought home to me helpfully by an article I read recently, while it's true that Christianity produced the values and the benefits and the culture of the West, it's just sort of it's not that's not a kind of an inevitable result necessarily of it, because if you go to other parts of the world, Christianity is flourishing in Southern America, Africa, China, parts of the Middle East. Christianity kind of will work in lots of different settings, and to sort of try and suggest this is the only kind of instantiation of Christianity that's worth looking for, it would, I think, be to do a disservice to the fact that Christianity is springing up in all kinds of different places, and the gospel sort of propagates in all kinds of soil. Ultimately, I think it does drive towards peace and justice and so on, but it's not a sort of, it's not something that the West sort of owns. Certainly not now. It's happening everywhere, and it will kind of, it will adapt itself in a sense to whichever soil it finds itself in.
It's interesting that you mentioned Islam there. So I have a idea in which I've been thinking about, and I actually haven't spoken to anyone about. So I figured, what better man to test it on than you? I was recently traveling actually across Turkey and all through the Aegean Sea. So obviously interacting with a lot of Muslims and just really trying to embrace as much of the culture as possible. And that got me thinking. So in Galatians 1 verses 8, Paul says that if anyone even an angel, were to preach a different gospel to me, then let him be accursed. So that and of course I'd say this whole idea is based on the presupposition that Jesus was who he says he was, say in John chapter 10, verse 30, and that he did die and he did rise from the dead. So we'll need that presupposition before we delve into this sort of idea or theme. So in what Paul said in Galatians, that would then suggest that angels can minister to people. And obviously it was an angel Gabriel, who came to the Prophet Muhammad and gave him the Quran, which creates Islam. And in the Quran, as you'll know, it believes that Jesus lived. It believed he was born of a virgin birth. It believed he performed miracles. They obviously stop at the fact that they claim that Jesus did not or is not the Son of God and did not rise from the dead and cannot forgive sins. So on that sense, there's a lot of similarities in the build-up, but the fundamental fact in which Islam preaches is different to that of Christianity. So it's very much based on a radical routine. It's very works-based. And obviously Christianity is faith-based. So when Jesus says that the bonds of religiosity have been broken free and that we have liberty in Christ, obviously backed up by Romans 9 with what we have, it differs to the very works-based faith of Islam. And we spoke about the three women in across the Bible of Rahab, woman at the well, Mary. So there's different teachings there when it comes to Islam. And whilst there are many similarities, the fundamental fact that Jesus was sent, is the Son of God and was sent to earth to die for our sins, that it's about your faith and not your works, that we can find rest in him, liberation through the cross. It differs to Islam, which, as we have established, and Islam was written in 500 years after saying that Jesus was not the Son of God, and we have several first-hand witnesses saying that Jesus did say he was the Son of God. So I guess it comes down in that sense to C.S. Lewis saying, was he a liar, a lunatic, or a lord? Was he lying about who he was? Did he believe who he was? It wasn't who he was, or was he actually the Lord? So in that presupposition, that's true. And then we have Islam coming about 500 years later, when Paul writes that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. If there was an enemy to God, and if he was devious, would this not be the perfect decoy in order for him to deploy?
Yeah. I mean, that's my understanding. I guess what I'm hearing from you is that perhaps it's perfectly possible that Muhammad did have an angelic visitation, but that was an angel of light. Yeah, well, disguised, that essentially a demon disguised as an angel of light, potentially, which of course we read about in scripture. So I think that's perfectly possible. Like you, I want to say firstly that there's a lot that, there's a certain amount that Christians do hold in common, obviously, with Muslims. And I know many wonderful Muslims who are, people that I get on well with and are good people trying to do their best. But yeah, I fundamentally believe Islam is a false religion. Obviously, I believe it's not true. And I'm quite open, sympathetic to that idea that it's in a sense, you could say that its origins are demonically inspired, in the sense that, yes, I believe in a devil, a Satan, who is there to try to create confusion, deception. And one of the obvious ways in which you might do that is by trying to as it were, find a foothold. And it has been a very significant foothold in Islam. It's interesting to me, that even in the Islamic world, though, there's often underappreciated and underreported, things happening, quite extraordinary things happening across the Islamic world, of people having encounters with Christ through dreams, through visions, and all kinds of other ways, as well as, the important apologetic work that is often happening as Christians sort of try to meet Muslims on their sort of intellectual turf. And in the big scheme of things, I often think there is a bigger picture at play. ultimately, we've talked a lot about the sort of the intellectual to and fro and the cultural forces at work in the West specifically. I think that's just part of a much bigger cosmic sort of spiritual battle going on in our world for the hearts and minds of people. And Islam is a huge aspect of that. My hope and I guess my faith is that God will one day, that Jesus will one day win that battle, and that actually we are kind of in the process of seeing that happen even in many parts of the Islamic world today. It's extraordinary to think that, I don't know, I heard a statistic, I might be misquoting this, so forgive me, but in Iran, for instance, in the mid-1990s, there were perhaps about 10,000 Christians, and today there are over 1 million. And it's a sort of, it's what the fastest growing church in the world at the moment, in the underground church in Iran. So I just think that, absolutely. I think there is spiritual elements going on in all kinds of ways in religions that have come and gone across the world. But I kind of have this intrinsic hope that actually God is doing things in and through those situations, even so. And in a funny way, I think it's sometimes almost the ground is more fertile, interestingly, even in places that appear very hostile to Christianity in the Islamic world, because once they see the truth, it suddenly blossoms up and flowers in an extraordinary way. Whereas I think the ground in Western Europe is actually quite hard, because secular materialism sort of creates a very hard soil to break through, actually, in a way that Islam is a different kind of challenge. So yeah, those are sort of some of my slightly unorganized thoughts on that, but I hope they made some sense, Joe.
Absolutely. And what I would just like to clarify and caveat is that in no way was that anything negative towards Muslims or Islamic people. Indeed, when I was in Turkey, the hospitality that I experienced was unrivaled. I'd never come across anything like that in the West as well. It was just a thought on the origins.
And I'm glad to, I would absolutely back that up. As I say, the vast majority of Muslims that I know are incredibly decent people, and that, that I'm not saying any specific Muslim is demon possessed or anything like that. But I mean, when it comes down to it, I would say at its origin, I would say that for me is a plausible account of how Islam sort of took root in the first place.
Sounds like we're singing from the same song sheet there. So, Justin, one person who has featured on your channels frequently over the years is Alex O'Connor, from the fiery young atheist to someone who is very widely respected and liked on both sides of the aisle, illustrated by the fact that he recently mediated the Jordan Peterson debate. You obviously get on very well with him, and you've really championed him over the years. What do you make of his past, his present, but then also his future?
I love Alex, and we are friends, and I've just been in the privileged position of happening to bump into him sort of early on, I suppose, in his rise, when he was still sort of, I think, probably 16 years old, teenager in his bedroom, firing off these quite Hitchens-esque videos on Christianity, Islam, and so on. And he's gone, as you say, through this extraordinary evolution, actually, where he's really actually genuinely opened himself up to the arguments of Christianity. He's lived with Christians, a university. He went and did a philosophy and theology degree. And in so many ways, I think you've seen his own sort of broadening into a far more nuanced understanding of the arguments for and against God. He had the humility to create videos critiquing videos from a few years previous, saying, I just didn't understand that argument, or whatever it may be. At the same time, he's been very clear that as much as he's sort of got a much more kind of an openness and friendliness, as it were, towards Christians and Christianity. He's not a Christian. He is still an atheist. Though I think, I don't know, I don't hear him using the word atheist so much these days. In fact, I think he's probably far more likely to describe as an agnostic these days. But yeah, and the future, who knows? I know, I'm sure there are lots of people praying for Alex, would love to see him sort of, have his own conversion moment. And who knows, it may happen. That when I've asked him about it, he said, well, I guess God knows what it would take for me to become a Christian. It hasn't happened at this point. And I think to some extent, Alex conceives of himself as being perfectly open. He's kind of, so, I think he says if there is a sort of a non-resistant, open type, I think I'm it. But in the end, it's very hard. I can't be the judge of that. I don't think even Alex necessarily can be the judge of that, because our own hearts are often not obvious to us. Only God, I think, in the end knows the human heart. But interestingly, again, as I said of some of those other characters earlier, I do see Alex, even as an atheist YouTuber, actually opening up the God question in all kinds of interesting ways. And I'd much rather have him doing what he's doing than not have him there, if you know what I mean. Because I think actually his work engages so many interesting, both atheists and Christians now. I think he's part of this surprising rebirth movement, even though he's not saying he's a Christian. He's still opening up the God question for a lot of people through his phenomenally popular YouTube channel. I don't agree, obviously, with everything he says. I don't agree with all the guests he has on by any stretch, but I really appreciate the fact he does sort of try to play fair and feature guests, now from a wide variety of Christian and non-Christian places. So I'm a fan, basically, and yeah, we'll see what happens in the future.
In Matthew 28, when Jesus is about to leave his disciples, he gives them a great commission to go and make disciples of all nations. If I, Justin, had put you on the spot now, having been on the forefront of this debate for decades now, what would your great commission be for the work in which you're doing?
Gosh. Well, I suppose if you're asking me what is my part in that great commission of going and making disciples of all nations, I suppose I feel that God has given me the task, the privilege really, of building a bridge between Christian and the Christian and non-Christian world. That's what I tried to do with the Unbelievable show for many years. And it's what I think I'm continuing to try to do now through this surprising rebirth project and other projects I'm involved in. Is I think it's a great shame, having been given that great command, when Christians often sort of just get into a holy huddle and sort of talk to each other and just sort of occasionally kind of lob out sort of fishing lines outside of their holy huddle to the outside world, expecting people to bite and be reeled in. I think we're expected to go to where people are. That's the point of the Great Commission. And so I'm trying to build bridges between those two communities, the secular and Christian community, so that they start talking to each other more, to get into their spaces, to have these conversations in the public domain. And yeah, at one level, my particular, I think, niche has been to address the more intellectually minded skeptics and atheists and agnostics and so on. I haven't particularly focused on, we've talked about Islam, but that's not been my focus in my career. I'm happy to leave that to others. I'm happy to leave a lot of the other ways in which people can be reached through sports and music and film and all kinds of, creative ways. My thing has been creating better conversations, ultimately, between Christians and non-Christians. And so I think that's the bit of the Great Commission that I've been given.
What a message to end on. Justin, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too, Joe. Thank you very much. Great questions and really nice to meet you.